Good evening. As I'm recording this episode, the summer of 2020, two extraordinary events have already contributed to make this year historic in its own way. Only time, of course, will tell if and how our imagination has been captured by the importance of what has been happening. First in the list is the pandemic, which I take the liberty of referring to as the so-called pandemic, at least until the ever-shrinking freedom of expression still allows the citizen of the Republic to express their own views. A pandemic, furthermore, that has somewhat unexpectedly blended with the destructive riots in many American cities. Of the riots, one of the curious related phenomena, at least in my opinion, is the destruction of historical monuments at large, among other wholesale episodes of looting and vandalism. Ex-Dr. Johnson used to say, "There is no state more contrary to the dignity of common sense than that in which the understanding lies useless." Because the destruction of historical records, monuments, or works of art will certainly not change the past, and, I suspect without awareness on the part of the perpetrators, the destroyers are the living proof of what Orwell predicted in 1984, who, when describing the life and the philosophy of the totalitarian state, wrote that every record has been destroyed or falsified, every book rewritten, every picture has been repainted, every statue and street building has been renamed, every date has been altered, history has stopped, nothing exists except an endless present in which the party is always right. Given that the statues targeted for destructions were especially connected with the American War of Independence and with the Civil War, I thought it may interest some viewers to refer to some records from the past, records that express a point of view different from that of the winners. Therefore, I will talk about a protagonist of the American Civil War who is easily forgotten because he was the president of the Confederate States of the South, the party who lost, namely Jefferson Davis. Mr. Davis wrote a very interesting book titled A Short History of the Confederate States of America, in which he gives the point of view of the South regarding the whole business of the Civil War. Now, given that slavery is still a hot topic after 160 years, it goes without saying that slavery was an abominable proposition, and it could be arguably held that men were too late to realize the horror of slavery, considering that it had been practiced for thousands of years. But no one can rewrite history. Therefore, in this episode, I'm only attempting to demonstrate a point of view different from that of the winners. A point of view not based on my personal beliefs, preferences, or convictions, but on that of some protagonists. Furthermore, to shrink the American Civil War into a 30-minute episode would be an affront to history. Take it as a beam of light passing through a minute window in a Gothic cathedral beam, focused on the minute corner of a massive mosaic on the cathedral floor. To start, according to Jefferson Davis, ignorance and credulity have enabled unscrupulous partisans to massively mislead public opinion worldwide, and to create the belief that the institution of African slavery was the chief cause of the American Civil War. In accordance to this view, says Jefferson Davis, the North is represented as having fought for the emancipation of the African slaves, and the South for the increase and extension of the institution. This view is not true on two counts. First, the dominant party in the North, the Republican that won the election, declared through their exponent, President Lincoln, of course, in his inaugural message of 1861, and this is an actual quote: "I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so." Furthermore, among the declarations made during the political convention that dominated Lincoln, it was confirmed that if a state wished to secede from the Union could not coerce it to remain, which, more than a confirmation, was a restatement of the conditions under which the original American colonies constituted themselves into confederations, the rules of which were established in the famous Articles of Confederation in 1777. More evidence were needed to demonstrate that slavery was not the key issue of the war when Lincoln issued the Emancipation of the Slaves in the South 2 years later, in 1863. He said he defended it on the ground rather not of principle but of military necessity. Therefore, the North could not have entered upon the war to abolish slavery. Jefferson Davis argues that developments in the course of the war cannot be moved back to the beginning and then made to be the cause of the war. I quoted Jefferson quoting Lincoln because Lincoln, of course, towers massively in the history of the Civil War. And I will here refer to some other aspects of Lincoln's life and words, generally supporting the idea that Lincoln was for America what Ulysses was for the Greeks and what the Trojan War was for the Trojans. That is, what the American Civil War was for Americans. For example, in 1846, as a congressman, Lincoln had opposed the war with Mexico, and in a speech that was to haunt him 13 years later, he said, "Any people anywhere being inclined and having the power to rise up and shake off the existing government and form a new one that suits them better have the right to do so. Any portion of such people that can may start a revolution and make their own so much of the territory as they inhabit." But when the South chose to follow the advice of Congressman Lincoln, Lincoln said that the South could not go. And when confronted with his declaration in 1848, he gave a reply that I am surprised it has not been memorized and repeated in all succeeding occasions when politicians eat their words and do the opposite of what they promised. For that matter, it is a serviceable answer for anyone who wants to justify quite plainly going back on his word. All he has to say, you would hardly think much of a man who is not wiser today than he was yesterday. Furthermore, after the conclusion of the War for Independence, in the Treaty of Peace with Britain, redacted in 1783, it is written that Britain considers the ex-colonies to be individually independent states and will treat with them as such. And even after the drafting and implementation of the Constitution in 1787, the sovereignty of each state remained with itself. Even then, there were two parties. One, conventionally headed by Thomas Jefferson, who wanted each state to be as independent as possible. The other, conventionally headed by Alexander Hamilton, who was pushing for a strong central government. For reasons that are outside the scope of this episode, this arrangement did not work very well, and when the convention of the now independent 13 states assembled again, they replaced the Articles of Confederation with the new Constitution in 1787. That the meaning of the Constitution may be stretched indefinitely to fit the will of whoever party has more money or more clout is a reality that few will deny, but many also agree that the Constitution helps to coat prevarication with the varnish of civility. Perhaps aware of the inherent limitation of the Constitution, the Founding Fathers framed its definition by consciously introducing a grammatical error. The Philadelphia Convention and the Constitution, the founding fathers said, was to transform the Union, presumably already perfect, into a more perfect union. With this background in mind, in 1860 only a small part of the country believed that the main issue of the Civil War was the abolition of slavery, whereas the preservation of the Union had reached a kind of mystical level thanks to which previous agreements were meaningless. Said Lincoln with his uncanny ability to say two almost opposite things, making it appear as if both were true. And here is one of statement on slavery. If slavery is not wrong, then nothing is wrong. But if I can save the Union without freeing any slaves, I will do that. If I can save the Union by freeing some and leaving others alone, I will do that. Among the less known or less remembered Lincoln's pronouncement were his ideas on how to deal with the post-slavery world. Early in his administration, he acquired land in Central America for the newly freed blacks, and he said to a black delegation, "Why would the people of your race be colonized, and where? Why should they leave this country? This is perhaps the first question for proper consideration. You and we are different races. We have between us a broader difference that exists between almost any other two races. Whether it is right or wrong, I need not discuss, but this physical difference is a great disadvantage to both of us, I think. In a word, we suffer on each side, and if this is admitted, it offers a reason why we should be separated." Naturally, African Americans did not want to leave a country which, as slaves, they had helped to build. However, the subject did not die entirely. The name of Marcus Garvey from 1887-1940 is essentially forgotten, but he was the founder of a movement that encouraged a sense of pride and self-worth among African Americans in the middle of widespread poverty, discrimination, and colonialism. Convinced that African Americans needed to secure financial independence from white dominant society, Garvey launched various businesses in the U.S., including the Negro Factories Corporation and the Negro World newspaper. Garvey was praised as a race patriot, and he wrote a very interesting book called Message to the People, which could be considered as a manual for daily living, written to help his fellow compatriots become self-respecting and proud citizens. But there were forces that bitterly opposed him and managed to have him convicted of mail fraud. Interestingly, in the 1980s, Garvey's two sons launched a campaign requesting that the U.S. government issue a pardon for their father. U.S. Congressman Charles Rangel supported the idea, but the Obama administration refused. Back to the main subject. If slavery was not the main issue, how could the preservation of the Union be of such mystical importance as to make a joke of the Constitution of 1787, which sanctioned the right of separation? Now, no moral or sentimental considerations, says Jefferson Davis, were really involved in all the controversies that finally disrupted the Union. They were simply political struggles between sections of diverse institutions and conflicting interests. At the start of the American independence, slavery existed in all 13 independent colonies. The slaves, however, were comparatively numerous in the southern and few in the northern states. This diversity was caused by difference of climate, of soil, and industrial interest. Slave labor was profitable in the South and unprofitable in the North, but no ethical contribution, or consideration rather, contributed to this diversity, for at the time moral scruples were not the issue. Industrial interests had checked the introduction of slave labor in the North and promoted it in the South. The same interests impelled the northern states gradually to abolish slavery, but they did not inhibit did not inhibit northern merchants from prosecuting the slave trade in northern ships between Africa and the southern ports until the traffic was forever prohibited in the southern states themselves in 1808. The first rift between the northern and southern states occurred when Napoleon Bonaparte decided to sell the Louisiana territories. At the time, the veiled threat of a dissolution of the Union, curiously, came not from the South, but from New England. And the cause for this potential split was documented in a letter of the period from one Massachusetts statesman to another. The influence of our part of the Union must be diminished by the acquisition of more weight at the other extremity, meaning to reduce the preponderance of the South, we should separate. The issue of slavery arose for the first time when out of the vast Louisiana territory was carved out the Union of Missouri. Eventually, there was an agreement that excluded slavery in all areas of the new Louisiana territory north of 36 degrees and 30-minute latitude. Even so, this growing conflict between North and South involved no ethical questions as to slavery. They were struggles for sectional or regional equality on one side and for sectional or regional ascendancy on the other. Says Jefferson Davis, they were struggles for the maintenance and destruction of that balance of power between South and North that was early recognized as a cardinal principle in the federal system. It is important to clear, then, the subject of the obscurity produced by irrelevant issues and the glamour of ethical illusions. Fanaticism, to which there is usually accorded sincerity as an extenuation, affords the best excuse to be offered for the original abolitionists, but that cannot be conceded to the political associates who joined them, for with them it was hypocritical cant intended to deceive. In other words, many politicians joined the party of the abolitionists for political or private gains rather than from conviction. And this should sound familiar when thinking about the position of contemporary U.S. towards Venezuela, for example. In summary, the opposition to the growth of the South converged, or rather, it was absorbed by the abolitionists and by other sections, all ending up in the Republican Party. The phenomenon whereby a political idea relatively unthinkable becomes not only acceptable but eventually enforced by force is not exclusive to the history of the United States. And I will extract an example from Europe and from the same period, the 1860s. With much simplification, Napoleon Bonaparte caused a lot of turmoil in Europe by bringing to the fore at large the idea of national identity, even among peoples who until then had been relatively indifferent to the idea. I'm talking about Germany, Italy, Serbia, Greece, Ireland, to name some. Napoleon propagandized, we could say, the glamour of glory, along with a somewhat mythical conception of liberty pulled out of the motto of the French Revolution, liberté, fraternité, égalité. Let's take Italy, for example, which became a nation in 1861, the same year, by the way, when the American Civil War began. Until then, Italy was a patchwork of individual states. The culture, the history, even the language of this assembly of nations were actually radically different. To give an idea, at the time of unification in 1861, only 3% of the population inhabited the geographical Italy spoke Italian. There was no desire at large for an Italian state as such. And what were then the causes that led to the unification? Some were accidental, some external, some political, and some we could call romantic. And the romantic reasons had to do with the influence of Napoleon's myth about national glory. French, rather than English culture, was the beacon of Europe. Imitation, as we know, is the best form of flattery. And why can't we, said especially the Italian intellectuals, why can't we be like the French and bathe in the glory of our nation, our flag, and maybe even have an empire like France. Contributing to this state of mind were all the English intellectuals who for generations visited Italy to admire and learn about Italian art, the ruins of ancient Rome, and so forth. They called it, as you may know, the Grand Tour. Now, this English predilection for Italy matched perfectly England's political aim, who wanted to check the growing influence of Germany and the power of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in Europe. I know I'm greatly summarizing, but out of this coalescence of separate motives, there was formed a coalition of politically and eventually military forces that made one nation out of a veritable quilt of many independent nations that had coexisted for centuries in the Italian peninsula. The culture of these different people were also very different, especially between the North and the South, and for a long time there were mutual accusations of racism, not entirely cleared even up to this day, which shows how easily limitations of language lead men into error. When do cultural differences become racial differences? Someone may answer that the color of the skin is the difference, but no. In the instance of color, the color of the skin is a convenient symbol to characterize the cultural differences reflecting hundreds and sometimes thousands of years that created those very differences. Another error, in my view, is to deny the existence of races simply because the word race has been loaded with negative and politically incorrect meaning. Race is not a monopoly of man. It belongs to the kingdom of plants and animals. For example, to create a new species of roses, you use two different strains of roses, not a rose and a buttercup, for example. To produce a racehorse, you match two racehorses, not one racehorse and a farm horse. As I said, illogical conclusions often begin with semantic or logical errors of language, and sometimes dreadful decisions leading to the death of millions begin with gigantic lies. A historical recent case at hand are the wars for the destructions of Iraq and Libya, to name just two. In Iraq, as you know, it was the mythical weapons of mass destruction. In Libya, the wish to bring liberty to the most prosperous of African states. Back to, however, to Jefferson Davis and the Civil War. In the midst of the growing divergence of interests between the South and the North came the raid of John Brown, to whom I have dedicated episode 41 of this series of historical sketches. At the time, all parties in Congress disclaimed sympathy with the objectives and the method of John Brown, that is, meaning, but in the country at large, the raid of John Brown intensified the spirit of domination in the North and crystallized the spirit of resistance against further aggression in the South. Other important grievances of the southern states had to do with the monopoly of the banking system by the North and the unequally applied tariffs for imported goods, which greatly penalized the South. Furthermore, the slave trade was never conducted by the people of the South. It had been monopolized by northern merchants and carried on by northern ships. Nor the North was wholeheartedly anti-slavery. For example, on November 7, 1837, Elijah Parish Lovejoy was killed by a pro-slavery mob while defending the site of his anti-slavery newspaper in St. Louis, the St. Louis Observer. Even so, always according to Jefferson Davis, the South did all it could to avoid the war. They sent a commission to Washington following an invitation by President Buchanan to discuss a peaceful solution. But on their arrival, he became so panic-stricken that he refused to receive the Southern delegation. Buchanan said that he had only 3 days of official presidential life left and could not incur more dangers or reproaches than he had already borne from the press and the politicians. Still, the commissioners remained in Washington and were assured that the North would not begin any military initiative against the South while they were waiting, which was not true. the administration was getting ready to reinforce the famous Fort Sumter, the assault of which by the Southern forces was the official beginning of the war. A war that would cause 600,000 dead and 1 million maimed or wounded. After Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, the Union Army was open to blacks, and the more blacks entered the war, the more it appeared a war for their liberation. But the more whites had to sacrifice themselves in the war, the more resentment there was, particularly among poor whites in the North. They were drafted by a law that allowed the rich to buy their way out of the draft for $300, and eventually these conditions caused the draft riots of 1863 in northern cities, which took place in an orgy of death and violence. On balance, the truth remains intact and incontrovertible that the existence of African slavery was not the cause of the conflict, but only an incident of it. In later controversies, however, its effect as a lever in operating on the passion, prejudice, and sympathies of men was so potent that it has darkened the whole horizon of historical truth. But this, as we know well, is nothing new. Thank you for watching. Until next time, I am Jimmy Molia for Historical Sketches. Good night.